Okay, welcome to everyone to our Clean Athlete Douglas Laboratories educational webinar, part of our ongoing commitment to bring valuable education information to you. We have an exciting hour ahead of us today. Our topic today is Fuel to Perform, Optimizing Nutrition for Athletic Performance. Let me first introduce myself. So welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Victoria Coleman. I'm an educator for Clean Athlete and Douglas Laboratories. I'm a chiropractor and I'm certified in functional medicine. But most importantly, I'm a clean athlete like many of you today. Today's a very interesting topic. It's applicable really to anyone wanting to optimize your health and performance. So keep in mind, you need not be a star athlete to benefit from this information that we're going to share today. We have today a special guest with us to share his expertise, his scientifically supported knowledge, and best of all, his personal passion to the care of patients and athletes to reach their optimal health. Please note, you may want to ask questions at the end of the webinar in the question box in your toolbar. We'll do our very best to get to your questions. However, if we run out of time, please visit our website at cleanathlete.com, where you certainly can gain more information and submit questions there and contact us. There'll also be a recording of the webinar today that you're more than welcome to revisit. So let me introduce to you today our guest, Dr. James Weinstein. Dr. Weinstein is a board-certified sports dietitian with a PhD in nutrition from the University of Connecticut, 2 master's degrees in nutrition and business administration, and is a lieutenant colonel in the military. James has spent nearly the last 20 years teaching the relationship between nutrition, health, and performance. He has worked with thousands of individuals to improve their health, from young military recruits and beginner athletes trying to lose weight to professional athletes, including Olympic gold medalists. James is a Category 2 cyclist and coach and has competed for more than 20 years. He's also raced in the team endurance event, Race Across America, on 3 occasions, and currently serves on the board of directors for U.S. Military Endurance Sports, a nonprofit organization that helps veterans and active duty military members build health through endurance sporting activities. Dr. Weinstein, thank you very much for being with us today. It's an honor to have you share your knowledge and experience with our listeners.
Well, gosh, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
We've reviewed your bio, quite impressive, interesting, diverse. We understand your expertise in academic achievement. So now I wonder if you just might share a little bit more about you. How have you come to this point in your career, so committed to efforts in nutrition and performance?
Well, thank you, Victoria. Let me start by thanking you so much for the kind introduction. And to the team at Douglas Labs and Clean Athlete, thank you so much for your commitment to athlete health and performance. And thank you for inviting me here to speak today. To all of those you listening out there, it's a pity you can't see my hand movements. I'm typically quite animated at speaking. But most importantly, I hope you all do walk away from this hour having learned something new or freshly inspired by something that I say here today. And I do hope to get to your questions at the end. I suppose my interest in nutrition began about 20 years ago. While I was in college, I had dreams of becoming a professional cyclist, and I started taking some nutrition classes and learned about glycolysis and the Krebs cycle and the mysterious electron transport chain, and I honestly couldn't get enough. I joined the military after college, became a dietitian, finished a few degrees and board certifications, and along the way I've spent about the last 20 years, like you mentioned, counseling patients. How and why am I committed? I believe it was probably Carl Sagan who once said, we live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology, and I like to think that I spend the majority of my days trying to change that by translating science at the technical level to the consumer at the level of common understanding and practical use.
Perfect. I think that we'll certainly see that through the presentation today, so thank you. So I have to ask you, of course, it maybe already came out in the bio, but your favorite sport is, obviously, you're quite an accomplished athlete. What is yours?
Cycling. I'm a born and bred cyclist. Love it. Love every part of it.
Excellent. So you're bringing from the trenches not only all this knowledge, but true experience and passion from your own love of sport. So again, our topic today for all our listeners is Fuel to Perform, Optimizing Nutrition for Athletic Performance. And I think the first place I want to start is this is a vast topic. So Dr. Weinstein, if you can distill down for us some key considerations in fueling and fortifying your body for peak performance, I think it'd be a great starting point.
Well, Victoria, great question and great lead. You're absolutely correct. The science of human nutrition is tremendously diverse, and trying to distill down to just a handful of key concepts in fueling for performance is really a challenge. But I can think of about three, which I've put up here on the screen for you. This first is really understanding the relationship between energy-containing nutrients and energy-sustaining nutrients. As you can see there on the graphic on the right, from the bottom up, the nutrients that contain calories provide you energy, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. But as I like to often say, you don't eat carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. You eat food. You buy food. You cook food. And it's good to have a good sense of what makes up the foundation of a healthy lifestyle, but calories alone won't do it for you. There are a host of other non-caloric nutrients, and they're absolutely necessary for metabolism. It doesn't happen without them. You need these energy-sustaining nutrients, vitamins, minerals, water, as non-caloric metabolic drivers, and appreciating this relationship and how these two work together is very important. The second is having a good appreciation for substrate utilization. As I briefly mentioned, you eat food. That food is made up of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And these are the calorie-containing nutrients that provide your body with the substrates for metabolism. Whether you're doing a 100-meter sprint or an ultramarathon or a multi-day cycling event, the source of the energy varies. This is a curious relationship as protein calories are preserved, and the energy source of preference for humans, anyway, is carbohydrates and fat. And the graphic on the screen is notional for illustrative purposes, and certainly there are some exceptions to this. But as our activity and duration increases, fat becomes an increasingly important substrate to provide energy. Caloric expenditure increases, as does the non-nutritive metabolic substrates necessary for substrate metabolism. Also, a bit of an unfortunate consequence of all of this is that oxidative damage occurs as a result of increasing metabolism. It's the body's natural antioxidant pathways, and they're important in the process of rehabilitation and recovery following any type of exercise. The last important concept in fueling for performance is born out of the physiology world. It was back in the 60s and 70s when researchers and trainers and coaches began to describe models of training periodization. That is how an athlete would vary their duration and intensity throughout the year to have the best fitness at the best point in time. Well, it took us nutritionists a bit longer to appreciate how nutrition could support training periodization, but we got there. Although there are several models for periodization, I do like this traditional one, and I'll give a little bit of explanation here. What you see on the screen are 4 strategic phases: a basic phase of high volume and low intensity, a preparation phase where the volume decreases and intensity of workouts increase, and then a race phase where an athlete would primarily focus on a race season event, which might occur followed by a transition phase, which is basically a recovery period. For a road cyclist in America, the road season is often in the May, June, July timeframe, but it doesn't hold fast all the time. So here's the question. When is the best time for an athlete to try and achieve race weight? I hope many of you are saying to yourself the base period and perhaps maybe in preparation. And when's the worst time for an athlete to try to lose weight? I hope most of you are saying to yourself maybe the race phase. So when do you think most common happens to me when an athlete comes and says, Jim, I need help losing weight? It almost always happens that an athlete will show up about 2 to 4 weeks before their big race and start to worry about achieving an optimal race weight. The idea of nutrition periodization takes into account a very deliberate and planned approach, whether it's weight, nutrient intake, nutrient density, vitamin intake, or even protein in recovery. It all flows into this. But that's at the strategic, the 50,000-foot level. Let's take a moment to talk about a much more tactical approach to nutrition periodization, and that is to pull out just a week and look just at a workout within a day of that week. And in that sense, we can describe 3 phases. An energy phase required immediately before and during a workout, the anabolic phase, which typically is described as immediately after the workout, and then the growth phase, which is the rest of the day. Again, there are several ways to describe this. I'm just using a traditional model here, and you may have heard of others. But the take-home point is that incorporating a deliberate, periodized nutrition plan is critical to health and performance. So thanks, Victoria. Great question.
No, thank you. That was quite detailed, and I love the way you pulled out that take a day out of the week versus looking at maybe the full year of training and periodization. So I think that really helps understanding what that one day looks like. and interesting, the need for different food and supplements, et cetera, and they're changing up according to the periodization. So that leads me into the next question, too. As you've mentioned, food and supplements. Let's discuss this right out of the gates, the idea of food versus supplements, food and supplements, and any misconceptions on what that can mean.
Oh, another great question. I think the first thing to mention right at the front here is that it is not food versus supplements. Food is and always will be the best place for humans to get their nutrients, and supplements are just that. Supplementation to consumption of food throughout the day. That's all it is. But there is more to it, and the most basic level, you need to consume the minimum to meet your basic nutrition requirements. The pyramid on the left at the bottom shows a foundational diet for health. I wonder if anyone out there enjoys the irony of me talking about my plate and the foundation of health in the middle of a pyramid with 3 different groups on it. I find that how we describe health in the United States in the food groups has changed over the last 20 years. So I try to enjoy with the graphic here. But a good way to describe a good healthy plan is using the My Plate method. And for anyone who's looking for more information on that, you can find it on the USDA website. It's the basic tenets of a healthy diet. It forms the foundation. But manipulating energy storage and consumption is a focal area for some wonderful research, and it's where we have learned a lot of things about how to properly carbo load, how to use periodization or nutrient timing to your advantage as an athlete. And finally, there are some dietary components that for an athlete are much more than just a foundational component. You might place caffeine up there. Certainly you'd put carbohydrate consumption. But at the same time, in a supportive role, you'll see that supplementation does have a place. For example, organized in the same manner, some supplements can be seen as foundational support, such as a multivitamin that would provide a wide array of nutrients. They may be consumed in inadequate levels in the diet. Same goes for calcium and vitamin D, which are nutrients that are quite important for bone health and may even have other important benefits to athletes. Probiotics are another foundational item for which a lot of great research is supporting very important benefits related to gut permeability, immune system health, and digestion, all by controlling the flora of the bacteria in your gut. Supplements may also play a role in energetic support. We know that many B vitamins are critical components of many metabolic processes. Protein is very important in recovery, and electrolytes are important components of processes including muscle contraction, nervous system messaging, and even improper sweat and cooling. Finally, there are some supplements that may show some promise in supporting athletes. At the top of the pyramid you can see there, or various endurance and strength requirements, such as creatine, carnitine, or lutein. But I think a lot of the times, Victoria, where athletes may get turned upside down is when the creatine shake becomes more important than the healthy dinner. But it still doesn't take away from the important role supplements might play in consumer lives. So great question. I appreciate that.
Thank you. I think you've done a great job at explaining sort of the macronutrient intake and micronutrients and how important they are in the relationship to each other, not one versus the other. This is a synergistic relationship and are necessary. And we think of the population base just at large is quite often deficient, which I know we'll talk about later. And then you take the special needs of an athlete. So those demands can be even greater on the body, and the macronutrients being the foundational part of their health, no question. So it isn't a matter of food versus, it's the synergistic relationship. So thank you for clearing that up. As we've seen many times in training, at least I have in some of the marathon groups, that people go out and do a hard workout, they come back, and what they eat is quite a sad state, but they think that maybe just having their vitamin or recovery drink is going to fix that up. No, food is the foundation to start with that should be taken care of, and then the additional support of the supplements to enhance. So thank you. So another question that I think is important we address is, can you comment on the idea of deficiency and insufficiency? Are they different concepts, or is it a scale, or can you just maybe touch on that?
Sure, good question. I don't have a specific slide on this one, but let me speak to that. So absolutely. Let's start with the context of a deficiency first. In its most basic form, a deficiency is a lack of something important, a requirement that your body needs for good health. I'm very familiar with iron, so I'll use an example with iron. So anemia is defined by having a low hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying protein in your blood. The most common reason, and there are several, but the most common reason for a low hemoglobin is because of a deficiency of iron. But there is a middle stage between having a normal amount of iron in your body and having so little iron that your body cannot produce hemoglobin properly. And this is a stage of iron deficiency, a subclinical inadequacy, that has an important bearing on health. There are several studies that found or showed iron deficiency to be linked to poor performance, lower productivity, and exhaustion, and other real consequences, despite not having anemia. The state of a deficient storage of iron or other vitamins or minerals for that matter does have potentially consequential outcomes. There's also another distinction which I'd like to mention between deficiency and insufficiency worth noting, and this one is a little bit more complex of a theory, but it essentially is a unifying proposition that suggests it is our calorie-rich but nutrient-poor diets that lead to subclinical insufficiency of vitamins and minerals, which may lead to the many health ailments that we see in society. For anyone who's interested in reading more about this, I know that Dr. Bruce Ames out of UC Berkeley has published prolifically on the topic. And his theory, his nutrient theory of triage, is really quite fascinating. It addresses this sort of deficiency versus insufficiency. The thought is that subclinical insufficiency of nutrients, that is, very poor quality diets, high calorie, low nutrient density, may lead to many of the chronic diseases and even may play a role in some of the effects of aging. The converse, which is currently being studied, is does increased supplementation of various vitamins and minerals then help prevent some of those things? So much exciting work coming out in this area of research.
Thank you. I think that, again, that clears that up, because it's quite often that the insufficiency, as you so brilliantly stated, subclinical. People maybe aren't aware specifically that they're having an issue because it isn't as the defined deficiency, but it may be affecting their performance, their optimal health. And we are living longer, and we have people of an older population becoming extremely active too. And does this insufficiency possibly affect us as we move on in our years? And I'd also like to comment that thank you on the iron discussion. Being a female athlete runner, certainly a common, I'm sure you're seeing this in a lot of females, is that correct?
Yeah, iron deficiency is one of the most common issues that we see certainly in female athletes, but in athletes in general. I know that there's a lot of people online, certainly for athletes exercising at altitude. I know female athletes at altitude that I've counseled over the years, almost impossible to get enough iron through diet alone, very difficult. And so, yeah, iron is definitely a concern.
I think that's a great example, and again, speaking from experience, that although the hemoglobin tested normal, not being absolutely clinically defined as anemic, still suffering with low ferritin levels certainly affects performance, and once those are corrected through dietary and supplement correction, the profound changes in how you feel and perform are incredible. So that was a great example, I think, of that sort of insufficiency level without being maybe clinically deficient. So thank you. I hope that clears up questions on where this can fit in, where nutrient enhancement can certainly improve someone's optimal performance. Okay, so no different than any other health program where individualized and personalized programming is really key. Can you comment on the different nutrient needs based on where somebody is in their training and their activity level?
Oh, good question, of course. So let's go back for a moment to the strategic view of periodization. Talk a little bit more about how nutrient needs might change based on the various stages in a person's training and physical activity. So again, I'm going to be showing a nutrition periodization chart here. This is, again, notional. This is just an example athlete that I'm taking here. But first, from the strategic view, here's a graphic look, and again, a classical model of training periodization where we would have an athlete work through a period of higher volume, lower intensity training, and as intensity rises, volume drops. What I've done in this fictitious athlete is gone ahead and identified some common nutrition goals and considerations for each period to illustrate how the mindset changes throughout the year, just as the intensity and volume changes. There are, of course, many other goals here. The goals that athletes come up with. In this case, under the base training period, this athlete's goals are weight loss and focus on training that would help this athlete better utilize fat as an energy source. Weight loss here is a key goal, as an athlete will need to restrict calories and even adjust carbohydrate intake to promote weight loss because the volume of activity is so high, nutrient, vitamin, and mineral requirements are still quite high. As the time period progresses from left to right, you can see that we adjust the athlete's weight goal, progression to maintenance, and then a shift away from the focus of weight occurs. Adequate protein, vitamin, and mineral intake and nutrient density continue to be important as the race period begins. Applying principles such as carbo loading and a focus on recovery fall into the spotlight. Below the nutrition goals, I've listed some considerations for how this person might eat during each of these periods. During the base period, the focus on weight loss, ensuring a healthy mix of caloric nutrients is key. In the preparation phase, a more stringent reduction in perhaps saturated fat and eating more frequently with nutrient-dense foods becomes important. In the race phase, we do much the same, but a focus on recovering properly to make sure that an athlete can make it from one event to the next phase of that event or to the next event appropriately, or with having recovered maximally is ideal. And then under the transition phase, I usually like to show a piece of pie on this side of the graph, but essentially this is where a lot of athletes sort of do the recovery that it's hard to be on all year long. And so smaller portions, eating favorite foods, eating more frequently, these are types of things that will happen during the transition phase. Let's take a look more specifically at what might happen in each of those individual tactical level phases of periodization. Again, this can be described in many ways, but here we are looking at an energy requirement phase occurring just before and during, the maximum amount of energy that's going to be expended that's occurring just during or before the activity. Excuse me, get a drink of water. Followed by the anabolic phase in the short period afterwards, and then a growth phase that occupies the time until the next bout of activity. Essentially, during each of these phases and immediately after, and then an until we meet again phase. So it's during, after, and then when we meet again. To answer your question of how activity might affect nutrient requirements, let's take a look at each phase in a bit more detail. Let's start with the energy phase here. Energy-containing nutrients are critical. Your body needs energy to exercise. It should be primarily carbohydrates in endurance-supporting activities, and I suspect I might get a few questions on this at the end. But typically, that requirement is somewhere between 5 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day. This doesn't hold true if you are an overweight athlete or very heavy, but it's the general consensus, about 5 to 10 grams per kilo. A healthy requirement of protein, and even branched-chain amino acids and healthy fats. To support the very high energy generating requirements of activity, hydration, and adequate electrolyte consumption are also critical during this time period. But also of important consideration is the oxidative damage that is occurring during this energy production phase and the potentially beneficial effects of adequate antioxidant ingestion. During the anabolic phase, restoration of used carbohydrate stores called glycogen is very important, as well as the consumption of a very high quality source of protein to ensure, excuse me, drink of water here, to ensure ingestion of essential amino acids that may be needed for restoration and anabolism in the body. An optimal consumption of a recovery meal immediately after a bout of hard activity should consist of both carbohydrates and protein source alike. Like I mentioned, a high-quality protein source might be anything as simple as milk or a sandwich, or there are many good recovery mixtures out there on the market. You'll see a lot of them have 3 to 4 to 1 ratios of carbs and protein. One great example is the Clean Recovery. Tastes great, dissolves great, and has what you're looking for. Also important during the anabolic phase are energy-sustaining nutrient considerations for antioxidants, as well as potentially important roles for branched-chain amino acids, which are proteins used as fuel by the muscles, and even a role for a non-essential amino acid called glutamine, which has been widely studied for potentially important effects on health as well. In the growth phase, the rest of the day, the focus is on consumption of nutrient-dense foods while avoiding excess caloric intake. But in this foundational period, and in light of the fact that many people are not successful at consuming nutrient-dense foods, a multivitamin is prudent and is considered a consideration for calcium and vitamin D adequacy is also important. And an additional note, there's a growing body of research on the use of probiotics and their potentially beneficial effects on health, immune function, gut permeability, as I mentioned earlier, and it's becoming a popular foundational element in health consideration. Like was mentioned in my intro, I've spent the better part of the last 2 decades working with folks, trying to help them eat healthier. The list of 7 items on the right is a great start if I had to distill down to just a short list. For starters, keep a diary. To improve nutrient density, include more color in your meals. But when I say include 3 colors, I don't mean from M&Ms or Skittles. They don't count. Focus on protein from plant, fish, and fowl. As I like to say, the less feet, the better. Look for food that you know where it originated from, is minimally processed and perhaps grown locally. And embrace the idea of marginal gains. That is, there is no easy way or a magic pill. And finally, I like to say that the word diet is a 4-letter word. And being healthy is about living a lifestyle that is a healthy lifestyle. So a few additional thoughts on supplements. As a dietitian, I think about healthy food all day. But I also know that there is a bit of tension that exists when talking about supplements. And it often seems that it is a food, like I mentioned earlier, food versus supplements sort of relationship. But that just isn't true. We know that the best nutrient strategy for promoting optimal health and to reduce the risk of chronic disease is to widely choose a wide variety of nutrient-rich foods. Ostensibly, this is the position statement of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. But as they also suggest, supplements can help some people meet their nutrition needs. An acknowledgement that not everybody consumes what they should be consuming, and that there are some high-risk individuals. So who are these some people? I believe those are your athletes, people who eat an unbalanced diet, which is an awful lot of people, children and the elderly, and certainly your elderly athletes. The idea that it is a prudent path to consider foundational supplementation such as a daily multivitamin is a very important consideration. And the idea that you can get all of your nutrients from foods is certainly a noble one, and one I do believe in, an idea I personally strive for in my own diet. But when we look at the contribution of supplementation to micronutrient intake in the U.S., despite about half of all Americans consuming a daily vitamin, vitamin intake still falls below the estimated average requirement, or EAR, as you commonly see, in many instances for many people. A couple key concepts. First, nutrients from foods are always best, but athletes may require a higher amount of some nutrients, and in light of the fact that most Americans are consuming a nutrient-poor, calorie-rich, insufficient vitamin and mineral intake diet, and the potentially negative side effects of the health outcomes from that, it's probably prudent to consider supplementation in many cases. This certainly supports the notion that dietitians have their work cut out for them, but also a testament to how it should not be food versus supplements, but rather food and supplement consideration. Yes, I know, Victoria, this was a long answer to a fairly complex question, but a good one, and I appreciate it.
No, that's you've done a great job, and I think it's important to address, like we said, it's not a matter of food versus supplements, and we've seen a change even when we're looking at dietitians and their recommendations. We're watching that shift. Maybe part of that comes from the diet today being so caloric heavy yet nutrient poor. Are we dealing with different environmental stressors that we didn't see many years ago? Is the production of food the way it used to be, and is the quality of the food, even when you're doing your very, very best to eat a balanced diet, is the quality there? Are the foods as nutrient rich as they used to be? Are there other things the body's having to deal with from a toxic insult different from what they were years ago? Then you put on top of it, like you said, an aging population and being more active in sport. That's a different needs group. An athlete themselves are putting their body through very different needs than maybe the average person who is a little bit more sedentary. So I've always seen in my recommendations and experience myself that even just a multivitamin can be a baseline insurance policy to make sure that we're getting the top-up that we require. Plus, a lot of those other nutrients are very involved in pathways in our body, biochemical pathways as boosters and things that we require for them to go forward. And I think it's important. You've done a great job at being able to address what the concerns were about using additional supplementation, but I think that that's now becoming a point where it's not as uncommon as maybe as it was in the past, and people are definitely looking for guidance on how to do their very best, not only in their food intake, but their vitamin intake. So thank you again. You've been very clear with that. So in commenting on strategies for an athlete to be consistent, to be effective in their training, do you have any ideas for them, any comments to help them stay on track?
Oh, interesting question. Strategies for an athlete to be consistent and effective go hand in hand. And I've been in the trenches working with athletes, patients, and consulting with other coaches and colleagues for a really long time. I can probably think of dozens of important considerations. But I think it's best to look at it in 4 domains. For an athlete to be effective in training, they must have a strategic plan. Part of this planning is setting goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. Periodization, like we talked of earlier, is important, and certainly a plug for professional coaching. Whether it's help with your diet from a dietitian or help with your training from a coach, this is a critical and very important step. Second, the importance of documentation cannot be understated. There are several useful tools out there, but without documentation of what you have done and how this affects you personally, it's really hard to adjust course. I like using MyFitnessPal for clients tracking diet goals, and TrainingPeaks.com is a great tool for athletes. There are many others. These just happen to be popular ones with coaches. Whatever method you choose to document progress, it's most important that you review that documentation and use it to make smart decisions. It's no good to just keep a food diary or to write down your training plan if you're never going to look at it. Which leads me to my third point. Third, decisions that a person makes should be science-based. Otherwise, you get caught up in marketing hype, false promises, and worse, potentially negative results. I don't think people should act as guinea pigs. That's what the lab is for. And there's nothing wrong with being cutting edge. But I like to say, just don't cut yourself on that edge. Be familiar with reliable sources of information or people who can provide reliable information. Don't always trust Google. Trust a dietitian who has experience or a physician who has experience working with athletes. And finally, and most importantly for athletes and even the general population trying to get healthy, there really is no magic pill, at least not yet. And we all seem to know this, yet day after day, patient after patient that I work with, they're looking for a magic pill. And so consistency, like you mentioned in the question itself, is really the key. You didn't get unhealthy overnight. You did not become overweight yesterday. And you aren't going to undo years of bad habits starting on Monday. That's just a fact of life. But if you embrace strategic goals and marginal gains as a success, good health is, and great performance results are, absolutely achievable for anyone. So I think these are the main 4 domains that I would say are probably the most important in consistency and effectiveness of an athlete.
Thank you. I think to also add to that point with consistency and being effective, you've given some really good strategies for motivation, for tracking, for helping an athlete stay on their goal. And also what we've mentioned before, using appropriate diet and supplementation so that they can continue to get into their training program and not be sidelined if they haven't used proper recovery fuel, as an example, and that causes some issues for their training the next day. That throws them off track. So making sure, I suppose, that they're addressing what the needs are to stay not only efficient and effective with the training protocol from a motivation point of view, but also making sure their bodies are being addressed appropriately to keep them on track, making sure, again, that they're fueling, that they're making sure they have a good protein source, that they have a good recovery fuel that they can utilize, and therefore not interrupt the actual training that they're going through. So I think your strategies and reminding also ourselves about keeping the body in its top performance to stay onto our training schedule. Nothing worse than being sidelined because of stiffness, soreness, or an inability to perform the next day due to poor nutrition. So that brings us to sort of clean athletes, extreme devotion and efforts. I want to talk about the NSF Certified for Sport. It's quite an effort and commitment. And what does that mean then to you as a coach, a trainer, an athlete, a teacher? You do all of these things. Can you tell me a little bit about what NSF Certified Sport means to you?
Great question. This is a huge issue, Victoria. It goes well beyond just athletes subject to U.S. and world anti-doping regulations. The bottom line is this: you as an athlete and consumer are responsible for what goes into your body. There's no other way to say it. You're responsible. When you consume food, you often trust that the farmer that grew that food in good soil. And if you demand organic, you are trusting that the farmer didn't use a host of chemical pesticides. When you consume a supplement, regulations are quite different. And although laws have gotten a little bit stronger, there is a real concern that you as the consumer don't know what it is you are putting in your body. To make this point, in a landmark study commissioned by the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, in 2001, researchers looked at 634 non-hormonal nutrition supplements purchased from 13 different countries and 215 different suppliers. They found that nearly 15% of the samples worldwide and almost 19% of the U.S. samples contained anabolic steroid and derivatives that were not on the label. These products were adulterated. Although this study is now a bit old, the issue is still an incredibly important consideration. Some of the riskier supplements use terms to promote weight loss, improve sexual performance, enhance muscle growth, and stimulate energy. Those would be ones that you would be keeping a wary eye for. So what is a consumer to do? So NSF is a third-party company with decades of experience testing and certifying products. The NSF Dietary Supplement Certification Program, they offer tests for label claims, toxicology, and basic contaminants, and the more specialized NSF Certified for Sport certification tests products for more than 200 substances that are banned by most major athletic organizations. Supplement companies have to pay a lot of money to this third-party testing agency to a company like NSF to conduct this extensive testing. It's more than a one-time deal. Lots of testing is ongoing. Production processes are verified. Even ingredient documentation is reviewed. It's very intense, and it's very important as a consumer, especially as an athlete consumer, that you look for the NSF Certified for Sport on the label of any supplement that you are consuming. If not, then you're taking some risk. The NSF Certified for Sport is becoming a very important part of many professional organizations, including the NFL, Major League Baseball, and the Players Associations for both, and many other organizations as well. I know that the clean partnership between the Major League Baseball Players Association and with Clean Athlete is something that Major League Baseball Players Association, the MLBPA, and Clean are very proud of. And it's a testament to the importance of NSF Certified for Sport testing, as well as the assurances that it provides to an athlete and consumer. We see this more and more, where athletes are not only testing positive for components that they are claiming are in their supplements, but this is a great way to ensure that the supplement you are taking is what it says it is on the label. And so NSF Certified for Sport as a practitioner is something that I almost always recommend for athletes consuming supplements. So how do you know if a product is NSF Certified for Sport? Well, here's an arrow pointing to the label product. So you'll see this icon on the label of products that carry this. The company's paid a lot of money to be able to be certified for sport, and so you can be sure that they're going to put that label on there. NSF Certified for Sport will have a little square box below the circle indicating that additional level of certification of the over 200 substances that often are shown as banned substances by many of the anti-doping agencies and world governing bodies. Bottom line, when you're looking at a product, look for this NSF Certified for Sport. So great question.
Thank you. There's a couple points. You've done a great job of explaining the importance of NSF and what that means to you and the athletes and people in general that you're working with. I really appreciate you recognizing the commitment and cost for a company to make the effort. Clean Athlete, as an example, has 9 products that they offer that have gone through the NSF testing Certified for Sport, and it is an expensive process. It is a strong commitment to our athlete base, and not just athletes. And another key thing we talk about with Clean Athlete is it's everything that your body needs and nothing that it doesn't. And it's important to know that staying away from artificial sweeteners and additional excipients that aren't necessary for the body is very important. So it doesn't limit something like the Clean Athlete line with NSF certification to just one of these elite athletes. It certainly can be utilized for just about anyone who wants to ensure that they're using an extremely clean product, as the name denotes. I also think it's important to to reiterate that partnership with major associations like Major League Baseball Players Association, but not just them, the NFL, the NHL, the PGA, the LPGA. What I think is quite interesting is that it seems that they're taking an interest now in their athletes, not just from the performance point or from concerns on doping issues, but just a general interest in the health of their athletes. And an example recently would be hearing that there's been more requests for a probiotic, and you wouldn't think of that anywhere along the lines of how does that relate to sport and performance, but a probiotic making a person possibly improving gut health, possibly improving immune function. These are really important things to keep a person healthy and hence keep them on track for the sport that they're in. So I commend the groups that are working with athletes and making partnerships with us at Clean Athlete to ensure that their athletes remain in optimal health without maybe the full discussion of just performance, because we know that a body working at its peak performance is going to work better versus a compromised body. So I think the whole NSF can go further than just the fact that someone can use this with reassurance that they're going to be fine as far as testing clean and adhering to the WADA list, but at the same time really optimizing their health. And so I do appreciate the comments on the effort that's been put into creating a line that has NSF certified for sport. So I'd also like to ask if you could comment on what you might see as common mistakes or pitfalls that you deal with some of your athletes that you commonly see.
Ooh, mistakes and pitfalls. Gosh, we could do a whole lecture on those. Well, I think it goes back.
Maybe just a couple top ones.
Yeah, sure. So, well, I think it goes back to that slide I had on health and consistency. I'll just move back here for a second. And effectiveness. Athletes that do not have strategic goals, do not use documentation of their efforts properly. They make decisions based on gut feel, but not using a scientific approach, and who are not looking at consistency and marginal gains, but rather a quick fix or a magic pill. I think those are the ones that are most likely to have pitfalls. You know, I think that athletes, and I'll put another foot stomp on this, marginal gains of embracement. You know, cycling is a good example of this. You know, I've seen athletes that, you know, will do everything right in their training, but you won't pay attention to their diet and will be wondering why they had a poor performance. Vice versa, an athlete who's training their hardest and they're eating great and they're doing great, but they won't care about their equipment and the little pieces of important parts of their equipment, and then their chain breaks on race day because they haven't taken good care of it, or you know, they don't have the most aerodynamic you know, equipment that might give them some marginal gains. And so I think it's important to realize that a lot of this stuff is additive, and that you know, it's not just good enough to just train hard, but you also have to eat right, and you also have to watch your equipment, and you have to get a good night's sleep. And so I think athletes who spend a lot of time looking at their training and their lifestyle in silos are setting themselves up for a pitfall. You know, it's not that this is my training and this is my equipment, but it's everything kind of interacts with each other. And so when an athlete embraces that concept, I think they're less likely to fall into a pit of despair. I think another one is listening to themselves. Athletes who don't listen to themselves often have problems. And a good example with nutrition on this is I've had athletes come in and tell me that, you know, they don't understand, but their body is constantly craving odd things. And that is a great example of when it's time to really sit down and look at how they're eating and the quality of their food, because a lot of times these weird cravings are a sign that you may be inadequate in a certain nutrient or mineral or vitamin or something in your diet, and a good practitioner can pull that out. So listening to your diet is listening to your body is important. I think the last one is listening to a coach. You know, if you have a coach, if you're an athlete who has somebody who is helping guide you, and they're seeing something or telling you to do something, and you think you have a better way, then you ought to take a step back and discuss that with them versus not listening to them. Because a lot of times, you know, we see the trees and not the forest when we're looking forward. And so sometimes taking a step back, climbing a ladder and looking out among the landscape of how you're doing, both from a fitness standpoint, a lifestyle standpoint, you know, sleep, diet, exercise, the whole gambit, which a coach can do, I think that will help. And so that would probably be the major mistakes and pitfalls I think that the athletes make.
Thank you. I think we've seen that mistake where people, it's a synergistic thing, and don't change your shoes the night before a race, and don't decide to go out and eat super hot spicy food the night before a race, and make sure you've been using a good nutrient and supplement protocol versus trying it that morning. And I think that you're right, people get caught up in the whole excitement at certain things and try what someone else is trying and haven't really practiced it in the right setting. So it's thank you.
Let me actually make a note on that. Let me make a quick note on something you brought up there. So
sure.
A really good point. Athletes need, and this goes for anybody that has an event, you need to practice what you're going to use on the event day. So if you're planning on using a new, a new energy drink during the event, please make sure that you practice that for weeks ahead of time. Same with the recovery product. If you're going to be using a recovery product after an event to get ready for the next event, this is something you should be consistent with in training, not something that you just pick up and only on the event days. So yeah, so being consistent is very important.
Thank you. Our time is quickly coming to a close, and it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. I wish that we had more time, but I think we should address some of the questions from our very attentive audience. A really good one would be, what about people doing multiple workouts throughout a week? Can you comment on maybe some of the pre and post strategies they should be using when they have several games throughout a week?
Yeah, so it gets a little tricky when an athlete is not only competing multiple times a week, but some athletes will do multiple workouts in a day. And so I think one of the most important things there, consistency, but also paying an extra special attention to recovery. That meal immediately after activity is important. And I know there's some research, more recent research coming out showing that maybe this magic hour isn't quite as important for people who aren't doing repetitive, hard activities, but I'm not completely sold yet. And so I think that making sure that someone who's got multiple events either in a day or in a week is consuming adequate calories to make sure that they're replenishing the carbohydrate stores that they use during the activity, and then immediately post-activity they're consuming a high-quality recovery drink or recovery meal so that they're getting adequate amounts of protein. Not to mention a lot of the stuff I talked about in terms of just that basic foundational approach of making sure they've, a multivitamin is prudent, making sure that they're consuming very nutrient-dense foods with lots of color.
Thank you. I think it's also important that we maybe discuss the timing of things. For instance, multiple events, busy schedules. That's where maybe a recovery post-event, a recovery fuel would become very appropriate if you have especially a commute before you're going to sit down to a good meal, and be able to have that, capture that window, that sensitive window of 30 to 45 minutes post training where insulin is, you're in an anabolic phase and insulin is ready to help in the healing. And so that would be, would you agree that that would be a good time to try to utilize something like that where it's portable, you can fit that 45-minute window?
Yes, on the timing, yes, I agree. And also I'll add that pre-planning is something that athletes tend to not do very well, even though athletes are very good at time management. It sometimes it's one of these things that you always like, how did you not pre-plan all this out? So an athlete who's got multiple events should be stepping back and thinking about what are they going to consume before, during, and after each of these events. My son plays multiple football and has multiple practices during the week, and we think about not only what are you having before the practice so that you're not going to get sick during practice, but what are you going to be drinking during the practice to make sure you're replenishing carbohydrates and replenishing nutrients, and then immediately after, and we make sure that we bring it with us so that we're not searching around for it. And so absolutely, I completely agree with you.
So what are your thoughts on, I guess, the needs of an athlete compared to the regular person? I'm going to throw something like vitamin D out there. Would you recommend that an athlete's needs might be at a higher level than you would see for the average population? And one of the things I want to point out is something like Clean Athlete. We have a vitamin D that's NSF certified for sport at 5,000 IUs. And so do you see the needs sometimes of the athlete being a little bit more than your regular population?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on a couple things. But yes, we know that athletes, like I mentioned earlier, the higher risk populations, athletes, elderly, children, elderly athletes, athletes that live at altitude certainly have a higher requirement for nutrients. With that being said, it takes sitting down and working with either a practitioner or really thinking hard about what nutrients you might be deficient in. For example, a cyclist who spends a lot of time outdoors training in the summertime, it's unlikely that they might be deficient in vitamin D, but flip that around. A basketball player who spends a lot of their activity indoors in a gym certainly could be. And then it gets a little more complex because athletes that are practicing in northern latitudes, which I've counseled several athletes in northern United States, Canada, like you, and then up in Alaska, where the wavelength of sunlight isn't exactly right to produce an adequate amount of vitamin D. And so vitamin D fortification or supplementation is very important. I wouldn't suggest that every person in the world would need it, but I certainly would think that it's one of those prudent foundational elements that we have to make sure that we are getting adequate amounts, and the amount in the supplement you described is within the range of what a good supplement would have in it.
Thank you. A couple more questions here I hope we can get in. What do you feel is the best way to get in enough calories, especially when you have a long training day?
Well, small, frequent meals works. Nutrient-dense foods. I'm a big fan of making my own energy bars versus buying energy bars. But starting with calories, I think that the trick is to eating every 2 to 3 hours, to training yourself to eat closer to your activity. I know a lot of athletes that they say that there's no way they can ever eat anything around when they're running. And I don't know if any of you know who Dean Karnazes is, but ultramarathon runner. And I remember reading his book and him talking about he could eat a pizza while he was running a multi-marathon. And it just the point there is that you can train your body to consume more calories. So that's really the answer: is pre-planning, eating frequently, every 2 to 3 hours, and then training your body to eat more during your exercise bouts, because that's a great way to avoid not getting enough calories in. Usually it's the opposite, by the way. Usually I'm having to help athletes consume less calories, but more nutrient density. So a comment on the nutrient density part. How do you know if a food is nutrient dense? And that's where that color sort of comes in. Nature's way of telling you that a food might be nutrient dense is looking for more color in the food. So yeah.
And what about the option for people that really can't tolerate the mass of food in the bulk of the food in their gut? Something like using a whey protein isolate, mixing that in with a liquid that isn't, don't take too much of it, but enough that the body can tolerate it, and therefore they don't have that heavy load feeling. Would you recommend that for people that are a little more sensitive?
Yep, and that's a great point and a role, and exactly why it's not a food versus supplements, but a food and supplements as appropriate. And so, right. Absolutely, and athletes that just can't consume enough. I mean, I work with a lot of runners who are very skinny, very tiny, and the amount of calories they need sometimes is at the limit of what they can consume, and when they're just not even getting close to the nutrients they need. And so, absolutely, this is when multivitamin, protein supplementation, and that sort of stuff can be very important, especially a high-quality protein supplement.
Right, which Clean Isolate has been able to achieve by making sure there's nothing else in there. So people that aren't looking to have heavy sweeteners or the additional things that may not be desirable for the body assimilates extremely well, so it can be carried in a pouch and mixed quite easily and utilized half an hour before an event or a training session. Makes it quite convenient. I just wanted to touch briefly on electrolytes in general. We've come out of a hot summer, and sweat rate is different for athletes, but someone who really does have a high sweat rate and they're an endurance athlete, do you feel that electrolytes are an important aspect they should be considering?
Yeah, yes, we should. And I think that sometimes it's an easy one to overdo or underdo. Generally, in an American diet, we consume too much sodium as it is. So generally, sometimes electrolytes in the average person aren't a big deal. Turn that around to an athlete, though, someone who's trying to eat healthy, who is following some of the recommendations that I made about, eating closer to the farm and less meat protein and lots of color, and all of a sudden, the amount of sodium and electrolytes they're consuming has gone quite a bit lower. And then add to that that they're outside exercising for multiple hours of a day, maybe a heavy sweater, maybe a heavy salty sweater. So yes, electrolytes are very important. Again, I think food is a primary source for where you should get electrolytes. But for some athletes that are competing in longer events, Yes, I think not only electrolyte consumption during the event, but you know, working with somebody on proper electrolyte loading is certainly a prudent path. You know, I know that this discussion could lead down into a point of whether cramping is related to electrolytes. I don't know if there's any questions about that, but I will say that electrolytes in general are very important for athletes, especially endurance athletes. Yes.
Thank you, and I'm happy to say that Clean Athlete has recognized that. So I think we'll close here, and really want to thank you, Dr. Weinstein. It's been an incredible hour that we've had with you, sharing all these from the trenches, so to speak, of your experience, not only as an athlete, but also in working with athletes and people in general. So I'd like to close with that thank you, and on behalf of Clean Athlete, I'd like to thank all our listeners again. A huge thank you to Dr. Weinstein for sharing this knowledge. Please be sure to visit cleanathlete.com for further information. And on that note, I would just like to remind everybody to enjoy your day, optimize your health as a clean athlete. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.